The engine of evolution.
Everywhere we look in nature, we see animals that seem to be perfectly fit for their environment. With that in mind, it seems as no surprise that early naturalists believed that all creatures on Earth are the direct product of celestial design. But in 1859 came Charles Darwin, along with his publication of The Origin of Species, which challenged the status quo by providing a scientific basis for evolution. His theory, natural selection, shocked both the general public and scientific community alike. And even now, after decades of repeated tests and verifiable confirmation, the idea of natural selection and the notion of evolution still arouses ample resistance and irrational opposition. Evolution is defined as the change in allele frequencies in a population over time. Two mechanisms for evolution are genetic drift and natural selection. Natural selection is a mechanism for evolution. Adaptation to an environment is key to being successful in nature. Due to natural selection, organisms with the best traits for their environment survive and reproduce, passing on the good traits, while traits that are not as good for an environment are basically eliminated. So if an organism has traits that allow it to adapt to its environment, natural selection works in their favor. The requirements for adaptation by natural selection are variability of alleles in a population, heritability, being able to pass on traits to offspring, and fitness, the ability to survive long enough to reproduce. If an individual is not adequately adapted to its environment, it is unlikely to survive long enough to reproduce. Natural selection affects the population at the level of the individual. Here are some examples of adaptation. Cuttlefish use camouflage to seamlessly blend into their environment. Cuttlefish are able to control around 10 million color cells in their skin with one neuron and can change their texture, color, and even create strobe effects in order to hypnotize their prey. Other forms of adaptation are mimicry. There are two types of mimicry shown here, Batesian and Mullerian. The top photo with two snakes is Batesian mimicry. Batesian mimicry is when a non-venomous animal looks very similar to a venomous animal. In this case, the scarlet king snake has a very similar pattern to that of the venomous eastern coral snake. This provides the non-venomous snake with protection in the sense that the other animals will assume that the king snake too is poisonous and will leave it alone. Another form of mimicry is Mullerian mimicry. Mullerian mimicry is when species all look similar because they are all equally dangerous. This protects these animals because if another animal has had a bad experience with something that looks similar to the harmful animal, the animal that had the bad experience will stay away from anything that looks similar to the harmful animal in the future. For example, things that sting all look the same because they will all make you hurt in the same way. In the previous slide, we learned that natural selection changes allele frequencies over time depending on how well each individual is adapted to the environment. Unlike natural selection, genetic drift has nothing to do with how fit an individual in an environment is. Genetic drift simply changes allele frequencies over time by nothing but chance. Genetic drift can sometimes overpower natural selection in small populations. If the sampling effect in a small population is too large, harmful genes will not be eliminated by natural selection and can remain in small populations, especially small isolated ones. Both natural selection and genetic drift get rid of genes or lead them to fixation. With this knowledge, you would think that over time, alleles would all be the same for each individual in an environment. But that is where random mutation comes to play. Random mutations are random in the sense that they occur regardless of whether or not they would be useful to the individual. So they are not always beneficial. But if they are beneficial, and the mutation helps the individual survive in an environment, that individual is more likely to reproduce and pass on the mutation to their offspring. Natural disasters that wipe out a certain allele completely is a form of genetic drift in the sense that the allele was eliminated by nothing but chance. Selective breeding also has nothing to do with fitness. People can breed plants or animals for aesthetic purposes or to have better tasting vegetation. The traits are being kept by the breeders might not even be practical in nature, but evolution is still occurring, even without selection. Animal and plant breeders have over the years been able to select variations of alleles present in organisms and transform animals and plants into whatever they want. Selective breeding was a good parallel to natural selection in the sense that specific changes can be seen in organisms as they are being selectively bred. Dog breeding, for example, has validated variability and heritability, which are two of three requirements for natural selection. Variability is validated because there is so much variation of alleles/traits in the canine gene pool that you can at this point sort of custom make a dog. Heritability has also been validated because breeders have successfully been able to pick two dogs with desired traits to make a new dog that inherits the desired traits that both parents had. The third requirement for natural selection is basically fitness, surviving in nature long enough to reproduce. This requirement is somewhat met, but not in the same way. Instead of nature deciding which animals are fit, it's humans that decide which animals should reproduce. Their method of deciding is purely subjective.
Having seen the effects of artificial selection through the selective breeding of plants and animals, it seems rather evident that selection is an impressive force driving evolution. But the process of selective breeding is an entirely artificial practice. And although selective breeding provides solid evidence for evolution by selection, it only vindicates two of the three requirements, a variable population and the presence of genetic deviance. How then do scientists strengthen their argument and account for the third requirement, fecundity? Furthermore, how do we encourage this process to occur in a more organic fashion? And finally, can selection act on the more complex metabolic processes that we deem vital to human life? The answers to these seemingly colossal questions come from a rather small place: microbes. These microscopic forms of life undergo relatively intricate metabolic processes and have a generational time of as little as 20 minutes. This allows scientists to quantify and qualify evolutionary change over thousands of generations in real time. In a historic experiment, Barry Hall and his colleagues at the University of Rochester purposefully deleted a gene in the E. coli bacterium that sanctioned the breakdown of lactose into a more suitable fuel source. To see whether or not the bacterium could adapt, that genetically modified bacterium was then placed in an environment containing lactose as the only accessible fuel source. At first, as expected, lacking the necessary enzyme, the E. coli could not grow. But after only a short period of time, a new mutation arose. That mutation allowed the genetically modified E. coli to break down small amounts of lactose by altering and enhancing the effects of an enzyme that it already possessed. Eventually, after enough generational lapse, the E. coli were able to effectively utilize lactose as their primary source of fuel. All in all, this experiment strengthened the argument that evolution can in fact act upon relatively complex biological pathways, all while emphasizing the notion that selection acts not by creating a new adaptation, but rather by modifying pre-existing ones. Fecundity, or the ability of an individual to produce an abundance of offspring, is the third requirement of evolution by selection, and in many ways the most important. The fact that some entirely random genetic mutation has the potential to enhance the survival of an individual in and of itself is astonishing, but that individual mutation would be in vain if it did not affect the reproductive fitness of that individual. To address this requirement, we turn to drug resistance and the invention of penicillin in the 1940s. When it was introduced, this miracle drug could virtually wipe out all infections caused by the Staphylococcus bacteria. But now, 70 years in the future, and several subsequent penicillin derivatives later, staph is making a comeback in a new, more resistant form. Initially, when administered, the drug was able to wipe out nearly all of the bacterial population that lacked the capacity to resist the harmful effects of the drug. Only a few strains managed to survive. Those that survived must have had some sort of genetic variation that accounted for resistance to the drug. And those that survived had fewer competitors, allowing them to flourish and reproduce, leaving behind genetically identical offspring that retained the genes for drug resistance. Those offspring then furthered the line of resistance bacteria until new, more resistant strains dominated the genetic makeup of the population. This phenomenon is natural selection, pure and simple, and it proves that adaptive response is in fact possible.
Natural selection in the wild is a slow process in comparison to human-involved selection in a lab. Thus, we are more likely to observe microevolutionary change, where we see small changes in a few features of a species. Microevolution occurs from mutation, selection, gene flow, and genetic drift. Macroevolution can be considered the result of extended microevolution, where changes occur between species. Besides time, natural selection may not be easy to see because it may not generate a species to change. This stabilizing selection decreases genetic variation while the population stabilizes on a certain trait. It is easier to see selection in the wild if a species is adjusting to a new domain and if it has a relatively short generation time. In the Galapagos Islands, Peter and Rosemary Grant studied the effect of climate on the medium ground finch. During a severe drought, the amount and the type of food, the ability to gather, eat, and digest became a selective force on the finch's survival. When seed count decreased on Dayford and Meyer, the finches with larger beaks could feed off of the limited seeds, unlike the small beak ones. Thus, the larger beak finches survived, and after a few generations, the average beak size increased. A similar selection was also observed with the saltberry bug over a couple of decades. The evolving/change of features itself takes a long time, so without personally seeing or first-hand documenting its process, how can we know that natural selection is truly involved with the development of complex features? An alternative theory, intelligent design, centers around a supernatural approach to how complex features evolve. It is a creation route to the unexplainable. Natural selection can use fossil records to its advantage to explain the evolution of anatomical traits, but with complex biochemical features that may involve multiple reactions, we have to look for simple precursors that came before. For example, in the blood clotting pathway, Russell Doolittle predicted to find an ancestral protein that would demonstrate how precursor proteins evolved to the pathway, and they did. Complex features of the eye can also be broken down to adaptive steps. In flatworms, the eye spots have skin folded to protect it and to adjust to light. Then in abalones, fluid in the eye helps form a lens to focus light. Then mammals have muscles to move the lens and focus better. Evolution through natural selection can be explained since each adaptation helps the eye to better focus on images and to let light in. Plus, it helps aid in survival and procreation in the long run. Natural selection takes genetic variation in species to create complex biochemical features. Natural selection is the mechanism behind adaptive evolution, though not of every feature of evolution, since genetic drift can also play a role. With the help of laboratory experiments, we can see and apply how selection plays in these transformations in bacteria, viruses, and different species. In the end, weak forces operating over long periods of time create large and dramatic change.
In conclusion, we've learned that evolution is not a simple process and can sometimes be unpredictable. Evolution helps us make sense of why things are the way they are, and understanding evolution will certainly help us in the future. Thank you for watching our presentation on the engine of evolution.